Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Joan Kuhn, and I'm the program coordinator at the Chappaqua Library. And I'm so pleased to announce that this is our first collaboration with Delaunay Michelle and a book YaYa. This is the beginning of a wonderful alliance, and the people that benefit are you. And we're thrilled that the community has supported this program, and we're thrilled to have it happen. So right now I'd like to introduce Delaunay, and she will talk about this evening's program.
Thank you all so much for being with us tonight. My husband Dan and I are thrilled to have the first event and a wonderful partnership with Chappaqua Public Library. For those of you in Westchester, you are the lucky ones who know that Chappaqua does fabulous events. So we're extremely delighted. And we can't think of a better pair of writers to kick off with than Lynn, Steger Strong, and Rumaan alum who are here with us tonight. Really quick housekeeping. Please keep your microphone off unless you would like to ask a question. You have two choices. You can raise your hand in the participant section, which if you click participants underneath the screen, a little box on your right will show up. Find your name, click more, and you'll see raise hand, and you can raise hand that way, and I will call on you if you have a question for Lynn and or Rumaan during the discussion. Or you can write your question into the chat feature. Click chat at the bottom of the screen. On your right, the chat feature will pop up. You can write in it. I can ask a question for you, or I will tell them that you have a question and you can ask it yourself. So this evening, I'm delighted to say that we have Lynn Steger Strong and Rumaan alum with their beautiful novels, Leave the World Behind and What? Rumaan alum is the author of the novels Rich and Pretty, That Kind of Mother, and the instant New York Times bestseller, Leave the World Behind, which was also a National Book Award finalist. His writings have appeared in the New York Times, New York Magazine, The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, Book Forum, and the New Republic, where he is a contributing editor. He also co-hosts 2 podcasts for Slate. He studied writing at Oberlin College and lives in New York with his family. Lynn Steger Strong's first novel, Hold Still, was published in 2016. Her nonfiction has appeared in the Paris Review, Guernica, Los Angeles Review of Books, Literary Hub, and elsewhere. She teaches writing at Catapult and at Columbia University. So Rumaan and Lynn are treating us tonight by they're each going to read a little bit. They will talk about the book first, read a short section. Rumaan will go first and then Lynn. And then once they finish that part, we will kick off the discussion part. I will start off with questions, and at any time, please feel free to jump in. These books are so rich that I know we're going to have a great conversation. So, Rumaan, will you please?
Yes, I will. I will. Thank you so much for having us. It's such a great pleasure. There are a few joys that compare to going to the library. So it's a bummer that we are not able to do it in person. But it's a real pleasure. Something is beeping in my house. One of my children's toys is beeping, I think. Yeah, and it's such a great pleasure to do this with Lynn, who is one of my dearest friends. And I hope that we can talk a little bit about our particular relationship as writers, because we both sent these books out into the world around the same time. My novel, as Delaunay mentioned, is called Leave the World Behind. It is a book about a family who are we're spending a summer week in a house on Long Island. And their stay is interrupted by the arrival of the homeowners from whom they've rented the house. It's a white family who are renting the house. It's a Black couple who own the house. And it seems like that's setting the stage for a comedy of manners about race, which it is, but it's also a book about a lot of other things that I don't know. Delaunay, you and I can figure out how to talk about that in the conversation going forward. I'm just going to read a short section from the book in which Clay, the father of the family, has driven into town to figure out something is wrong in the world. And so he's got in the car and driven into town to figure out exactly what is happening. It's hard to look down and look up at the camera, so bear with me. The brain was a marvel. You could drive without wholly thinking about driving. Sure, familiar routes, the everyday commute, start the car, find the highway and maneuver through the lanes, take the usual exit, glide to stop at red lights, move forward at green ones. while not exactly hearing the top stories being reiterated on NPR, or thinking about some slight at the office, or remembering a production of The Pirates of Penzance you saw this summer between 6th and 7th grades. Driving was rote. It was something you just did. He wasn't actually thinking about the production of The Pirates of Penzance he'd seen the summer between the 6th and 7th grades, though he remembered that as the golden temporary season in which he'd still been his mother's favorite child. But he must have been thinking about something, because Clay turned at some point and drove for some distance. He found estimating distance and measures of volume impossible, and realized that though he was definitely on a road, a more serious 2-lane road, the sort of road the GPS would know and name, he could not be certain, not really, that it was the road he'd wanted. There were directions written down in Amanda's notebook, of course, but Amanda's notebook was back at the house in Amanda's Vuitton bag. Anyway, the ability to take written directions to one destination and simply invert them to move in reverse was an obsolete art. It was like winding the car windows down with a crank. Human progress. Clay was lost. Everything was green. There was nothing to hold on to. There were some trees, there was a field, a glimpse of a roof and the promise of a building, but he couldn't say whether it was a barn or a house. The road curved, and then he emerged somewhere else where there was another field and some more trees and another slice of roof or barn or house. And Clay thought of those old cartoons that recycled their backgrounds to create the illusion of movement. It was impossible to say what was more sensible, to stop the car and backtrack, or to forge ahead as though he knew where he was going. He didn't even know how long he'd been driving, or whether he'd know the turn back onto the road that led to the gravel driveway up to the house where his family waited. He didn't know whether that road was marked by a sign or what the sign would say. Maybe he ought to have paid closer attention. Maybe he ought to have taken this errand more seriously. The sound of the wind and the sensation of it on his face was distracting. Clay slowed the car a little and sent the windows back up, then jabbed at the center panel until the air conditioning came to life. He continued straight, but that wasn't exactly correct, since the road undulated and twisted, and maybe he'd gone in a complete circuit, and that was why the trees and occasional buildings looked so familiar, because they were. He found a piece of gum and put it in his mouth. Fine. There were no other cars, and he didn't know if that seemed odd or not. Anyway, it was not the kind of road for stop signs. The local planners trusted the local people. He pulled onto a dusty shoulder and turned the car around and drove in the direction from which he'd come. Now nothing looked familiar, though he'd just driven through it. It was all inverted, and he noticed things on the left side of the road that he'd missed when they'd been on the right. An amateurish painted sign reading McKinnon Farms, a lone horse standing in a field, the remains of a building that had burned down. He drove and then slowed because he felt he must be close to the turn back to the house, but he wouldn't take that. He would drive on in the other direction where he knew the town waited. There was a road on his right, and he turned to look up it as he passed, but it was not the road that led to the house, because that road had that little painted shack where you could get a dozen eggs for $5. He sped up and drove on. There was another turnoff, but again, no painted shack. Then he wondered whether he'd turned twice to get to the road where he now found himself and was looking for a landmark that did not exist. Clay took out his phone, though he knew you weren't supposed to look at your phone as you drove, and was surprised that it did not seem to be working. Then he remembered that it, of course, had not been working. That was the real purpose of this errand, not an ice-cold Coke. He had driven out to show everyone that he was a man, in control, and now he was lost and felt ridiculous. I'll stop there.
Love that. Thank you so much, Rumaan.
Thank you.
What a great way of setting up Lynn, too, with the level of loss that the characters in your novel are in. Lynn,
yeah.
right? You'd be so kind, Lynn, to give the attendees a little setup about your novel as Rumaan did before you read.
Absolutely, yeah. And thank you so much for having me. As Rumaan said, we think our novels are in conversation, so it's exciting to get to be in conversation. My novel it's about a woman who declares bankruptcy and gets in touch with an old friend, I guess, is the short version. But I think, like you said, the sort of the idea of lost on a road with no markers is probably as solid a description as any. So I'm just going to read a very short bit. Maybe one thing to know, this is the day before the couple declares bankruptcy, and the main character has to take her children to a birthday party. That weekend, I sleep past 6. I lie up in bed as my husband makes the children breakfast, reminds them to use the bathroom, asks them if they want to help him knead the biscuits. I'm awake, but I pretend that I'm asleep so I can stay in bed a while longer and just listen. I climb down when he calls to me to say that breakfast is ready and we eat together before he leaves for work. Don't forget the birthday party, he says before he leaves, and I say, oh fuck, before realizing the kids are right there watching, and both of them look up and smile at me. The 4-year-old whispers something to her sister and they laugh and run into their room. We have no present for the birthday party and we have no time to buy one, so I have the children pick 2 books that they don't like much and a toy they haven't played with in a while, and we make wrapping paper out of computer paper by drawing pictures on it, and we wrap all of it up using a stapler because we don't have tape. As soon as we walk into the ground floor of the brownstone, the 4-year-old says loudly to the mother of the child whose birthday we're attending, my mom didn't have time to get a gift, so she made us wrap up our own toys. I look up and smile and walked past this woman toward the back of the house while the kids head into the main room, where a TV that covers almost the whole wall plays a loud cartoon and children climb over top piles of toys and squeal and scream. There are Bloody Marys in the kitchen, says another mother. It's 11 in the morning. Great, I say. In the kitchen sit 7 other mothers and the father of the child whose party this is. He mixes Bloody Marys, all the ingredients set before him, half-empty jars of olives and tiny onions. He pours one out for each of us, taste testing, dipping a finger in each glass and licking before handing us our drinks. There's this Korean place, though, says one of the women. I've come in mid-conversation and they seem to be comparing places where they go to seek self-care. They cover you in this thick, salty mud, then spray it off of you with this incredibly strong hose. It doesn't hurt, though. It feels amazing. I mean, it sort of hurts, but like good hurts, she says, like waterboarding the dead skin. I go to the Russian baths in Queens, another woman says. There's a sensory deprivation tank in Carroll Gardens, says a woman who wears the softest looking turtleneck I've ever seen. It's like $200 for 40 minutes, but you leave feeling like you've come fresh from someone's womb. Botox, says another woman, reddening a little. I'm almost 40, she says. I got this chemical peel a couple of weeks ago. She makes a high-pitched sound that might be meant to be a laugh and reaches her hand up to her cheek. I feel better when I like the way I look, she says. This fucking world, though, says another woman. We have to do what we can. Klonopin, says another woman. Xanax and weed. What I really want, though, says the only woman who has not spoken up until now. She sits on a stool in the corner of the room and has already sucked down to just the ice of her Bloody Mary. She is very thin and wears a blue silk shirt, and her dark hair is pulled back from her face. I don't want to talk, she says, or think. I want to stay standing with my shirt and shoes on and my pants around my ankles and a curtain held in front of my face, and I want a strange man that I have never met and never have to meet to fuck me hard, and then I want to leave. The next morning, which is the morning before we go to court to declare ourselves bankrupt, I wake up early, even though it's still the weekend, and I run 15 miles into Manhattan and back home over the bridge. The sidewalks are still covered in ice, and I fall 3 times and scrape my palms through my gloves, and when my husband sees them, bruised and bloody as I peel off all my clothes and climb into the shower, I look at him and say self-care, and he laughs. That's fine. I'll stop there.
That was fabulous. That was so dead on pitch perfect for the Or they keep in conversation, even if you don't think it's through. So, Rumaan, I just want to say quickly, I'm going to tell everybody that you were so fabulous to suggest Lynn. And as I read, because I read Rumaan's book in the fall, and then Lynn, when I read yours, I was like, this is amazing how beautifully y'all dovetail together and veer off and keep coming back like a beautiful strand of DNA. So, Rumaan, I'm going to let your section that you read kick us off. I love that you surprised us and didn't read the grocery list section.
Yeah, I wanted to read something different. Yeah.
And all of you have to buy these books because every section is great. But with The Lost, which, you know, we all just felt right there with you with, oh my God, and everything looks different and I'm horrible at this. And Lynn, you know, finally we find out the end, Elizabeth's name, her family is lost. But what really struck me about y'all's books is kind of going down under the lost is a sense of being left behind by the institutions and the things that are meant to hold these families. Lynn's main character family, obviously kind of financial acuity and ability to take care of themselves as a family. Rumaan, Amanda, and Clay's ability just frankly to have a goddamn vacation. Right, like in a place that should work, mountains and a house that they see. So they're very much lost. But I want y'all to speak about this, both of you, please. There's also this left behind sense that has them isolated in an environment that seems almost claustrophobic. Very much, Lynn, with all the pressures that your characters are under. And then Rumaan, almost claustrophobic with the horror that's unfolding, the isolation, and then their presence of the owners in the home. So if y'all wouldn't mind talking about the sense of lost, left behind, but that isolation, claustrophobia, I would love that. Wherever y'all want to veer.
It's funny to hear you put it in those terms because I'm not sure I would have thought of that, but I think you're correctly identifying that Lynn's and my work have this sort of shared interest. I mean, we are very good friends and we were working on these books simultaneously, but I also think that it has to do with what's happening culturally, right? Like a book is always going to reflect the moment that preceded it, or that, you know, sort of, you know, the book is the gem and the culture is the sort of like the pressure, right? And so whatever the pressure is that's prevalent in the culture will be reflected in the books that culture produces. And if both Lynn and I are talking about a sense of the individual as cut off from society, certainly the moment right now of coronavirus has made that very, very literal. But I think that that's been the American condition for a while now, right? I mean, Lynn, like what you're talking about in the book is sort of like, in Lynn's book, the narrator is talking about, as she said, like the family's sort of delicate financial, their sort of slow slide into financial collapse. But what she's really talking about, I think, Lynn, I don't know, you correct me if I'm wrong, is the failure of like every system of American life that sort of was extant when maybe our grandparents, right, were at the age that we are now, that like we've sort of demeaned the social project to the point that now Americans are just adrift. I don't need to tell anyone in this room that, like, we all got a check for $600 since last year to take care of ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I love what you read, because I feel like one of the things that my book is about is how many avenues for success have been closed off to Americans for a long time, but that there's also this particular narrative around success that makes it feel shameful when it's not achieved. And I think that shame is in a lot of ways where the sense of isolation comes for my character and a lot of characters, you know, and a lot of individuals in our society. And I think in that way, again, it's one of the ways that Rumaan and I have very similar interests, which is the American middle class. And that's sort of like striving. I think in the case of my character, she sort of reached and then fell off a cliff. Rumaan's characters maybe reached and had it, but then still the world was pulled out from under them. And I think that feeling of like the world could be pulled out from under you at any time, to Rumaan's point, and I think maybe most of us knew this, like that felt like this long before the world was actually pulled out from under us, you know.
It's just literal now.
Yeah, exactly.
It's much more literal. Coronavirus, what as difficult as coronavirus undoubtedly is in very real material ways, I think that if you have to say, like, if you have to treat it the way your parents told you and like say something nice about it, you can say this. It has clarified the way in which all of our sense of American inequity was correct. And it has made it much harder to argue the opposite. For a long time, a lot of these conversations were really theoretical and really abstract. And coronavirus has conclusively ended that period, especially of American liberalism's ability to say like, oh, this is all theoretical. You can pull up your bootstraps, you can do whatever. You actually can't. It cannot be done. It cannot be done, and we can no longer pretend that it can be done.
But I mean, I felt like that's what was brave about both of y'all's books, was that you unsparingly showed these two families to whom that has happened. Lynn, she's in a bad pickle. It happened quickly, but it was her college debt and the cesarean and then the teeth and it was also, all of those the food. I mean, at some point I want you to address how food plays out in your novels, and Rumaan, and then bringing in, the issue of race. Y'all do not shy away from it. You make it very clear to the reader, this is exactly where they are. And y'all did this before Corona, as you were saying, Rumaan. I'd love for y'all to talk about that. You write novels where it's completely not theoretical. And you did this before, as you said, we're seeing that. So I'd love for you to speak about what that experience was like writing it. Did it feel like you were, saying the bad word at the fancy dinner party or let's talk about?
I mean, it probably felt that way for Lynn more than for me, because for Lynn, right, like it's so much more uncouth actually for Lynn to talk about like backward class progression, because that's what fundamentally her book is about. It's about moving from the educated established middle class to which we're all taught to aspire, and watching that slip out of your hands because of college debt, because of whatever reasons, systemic reasons and personal bad decisions,
and
right?
while her character is lauded for having it, the parents were like, oh, you're Ivy League, so she's in that double mind of like, and it's gotten me what? And I'm jealous of your security and I hate myself for being jealous of it. You really nailed it. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe one thing, again, like I love this game of thinking about how our books are sort of in conversation. And I think one of the ways, even in what you're just saying, is that, and probably a lot of conversations that we had, is this way that there's a certain type of fiction that talked a lot about anxiety, and it talked about anxiety from the perspective of individuals who maybe didn't have a concrete relationship to any type of precarity, but felt generally like, oh, shit's sort of bad, but like, I'm okay, and I think to me, one of the main tasks that I set up for myself was like, no, the bad thing happens. Like, I want to write a book in which the person is not just scared. Like, it's not about a sort of shapeless, abstract idea of anxiety. It's the enactment of an actual precarity, and then what happens as a result. And I think in that way, Rumaan's book is very similar. Something actually happens, and also then the reality that like no one is coming to save you. So what does one do, and what does that say again about those avenues that we're told would keep us safe, but they're not safe anymore? Where does that leave us? And talking about it feels like a useful place to start.
Right, because Lynn, it's such a transgression to even say what you just said in the company of people like our parents, right? Like you would never, like you acquire a certain kind of higher education, you do all of the proper, you become the kind of model citizen that you were meant to become. And so usually you were left feeling that A, you have nothing to complain about in the context where there's like real poverty and real need, and B, that if you do have something to complain about, you don't say it. You don't talk about your debt. You don't talk about like the deranged ratio between one's earning potential and one's student debt, which is a contemporary phenomenon, right? That's a contemporary phenomenon. It did not exist in post-World War II America. So, it's just like, I think what you and I both did, I mean, I've never said this to you before, but I think it's like making that explicit, saying that aloud feels very uncouth. Yeah. But I feel like that's what we wanted to do, inside of the context of like a made up novel, obviously, but you know, especially for you as a woman, like to like say the thing that is like, you know, propriety usually precludes you, even as that party guest said, right? She doesn't want to get a facial. She wants to have
anonymous sex.
A sexual encounter, right? Like it's like your whole book is akin to saying something like that at a child's party, you know, to saying the thing that like you're not really supposed to say.
Yeah, well, and you've been to some of my children's parties, so it's
yes, I have. I certainly have.
Yeah, and I think too, like just to, and we can go on to the next question, but it's a matter of the particular nefariousness of engaging with the idea of the thing instead of the thing itself, which I think is not, we sort of attribute to other, like we don't attribute to thoughtful liberal individuals or whatever, but I think like an adjunct professor is a great example, right? Like the idea of the thing is quite shiny and quite lovely, right? And like my protagonist parents can say at parties, well, my child is a Columbia professor, but the thing itself is their child has also just declared bankruptcy and is about to get kicked out of her apartment, and she continues to be a Columbia professor. That is true, and in whatever way that's impressive, I guess I'm a Columbia professor. I guess it is, but the thing itself is a completely different thing that no one wants to talk about, not least because the idea of the thing makes you feel good about yourself, right?
I have a friend who's exactly dealing with the exact same thing at an Ivy League college.
Yeah.
So in talking about this, what I was thinking about was that y'all both, so not only were you very honest about this situation, didn't pull any punches, but you also wrote about your characters' physical pleasures, physical wants, desires, fulfillment or not, sexually and with food and with their children, also in a very, I thought, honest, open, brave, kind of anti-social. And it also definitely went against, which Rumaan, I think we talked about in the fall, like I loved reading parents who like one, enjoy sex, and two, love their kids. Lynn, thank you for not having a female protagonist like Rumaan did not, of, you know, that she's going to be smarter. She didn't want to be a mother. But I would love to hear, was it a more conscious choice that you wanted to bring in this very physical world of your characters? Was it an organic, probably a little bit of both? But I'd love to hear the genesis of that for y'all, with how it intersected with the themes that y'all are grappling with.
You want to take it? You want me to take it?
I mean, the first thing that occurs to me is that when Lynn and I talk, which we do like twice a week, one thing that we talk a lot about is pleasure. And usually when we talk about writing, we talk about readerly pleasure, you know, like the pleasure of like a nice sentence, the pleasure of a character who feels really real, whether she's hateful or likable. But I think that some of what you're talking about is like the pleasure of sensory experience can make the book feel alive and real. And so I situate that in things that I know I can write about, and things that frankly I think are pleasurable, like food. I love to eat food. I love to cook food. Maybe less now after 365 days of cooking 3 meals a day for 2 like garbage disposal kids who like, we don't have leftovers anymore in this household. So like most of us, cooking has sort of like the shine has worn off, but I find that pleasurable, and I find it pleasurable to write about, and it's a very human thing that I think people can relate to, you know. I don't know, but the sex is like, and Lynn, like the way you write about the body and the way you write, like Lynn's protagonist goes running all the time, right? Like the way that you talk about body and its experience of movement feels very much about like a pleasure that you know and experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's again, it's a thing that I feel like we've talked about a lot, but you guys weren't there, so you know, but the idea that language is not life, a novel is not life, but it is an attempt to portray the sensations of the lived experience, you know, and I think there's something about the way there's fiction that's supposed to be smart, and sometimes if it's smart fiction, it's supposed to be all about ideas. But to me, the body is so much a part of lived experience, right? And it's all mixed up together. I mean, that's one of the reasons it was really important to me, for instance, that the mother in the novel still be nursing, is because there's something so fascinating and exciting to me about the particular physicality of nursing a baby, and how that represents so much of what it is to be a mother. I was talking to a friend this morning, and she was talking about, she's talking about nursing and the like extraordinary power of it. And I was just like, I don't know why every novelist everywhere doesn't use it, because it's the greatest metaphor ever, you know? And I just think, like, back to what Rumaan said too, you know, we wrote books that could be considered a little bit bleak, you know, and we're writing at a time about systems that are broken, but we're also writing about being a person, and being a person, even at the bleakest moments. I think there's pleasure. It disappears. It's not long lasting, but we're capable of it, not least inside of our bodies.
Well, yeah, I mean, the need for it is so profound. You know, one, just to remember, I am here on this planet, and the psychic pleasure, as y'all were talking about, makes it so much more real. So I love that y'all gave us and the characters that.
Especially in a social context, a cultural context that has spent like literally thousands of years telling women that they shouldn't have sexual fulfillment, right? Like like we're like thousands of years into that project.
Women who are mothers.
Yeah, you know, we have literally for centuries that has been the message from almost every aspect of human culture. And so there's something, again, like there is something very disobedient about Lynn's book. And I think you heard it in that section that she read, like the expression of that kind of thing from a woman is just like, it's, you know, it's not that it hasn't been portrayed in art. It's just that the message has been obscured by a lot of other social counter programming. If you think about what we all did in March this time last year, when our government began to close down, we all went grocery shopping. Now, of course, we all had to go grocery shopping because we need food to survive. But I think you know what I'm talking about when I say there was a sort of like individual project of saying like, I'll learn to make sourdough bread, or I'll make a cake and we'll have afternoon tea for no particular reason. There is a reason for that. There's a very human reason for that. And, you know, it shouldn't be demeaned. It shouldn't be demeaned. There's something very important in that. Like, if you can't wrest pleasure from an uncaring world, then what's the point? Really, what's the point? If it brings you pleasure to make pink cupcakes and have them at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, then you should. And that's got value, you know?
With the store-bought frosting and the cake.
Yes, exactly. Just like in my book,
Yeah. And so, okay, so speaking of that, the wonderful scene in your book, Rumaan, with the pasta at midnight, which is one of my favorite, with Ruth and GH and Clay and Amanda, that coming around. I would love for y'all to talk about how, you know, and Lynn, with your main characters, relationships and non-relationships with the other teachers that she works with, that sense of, you know, what I felt was heartbreaking also about y'all's books was, and I want to talk about the race issue that y'all addressed so profoundly and delicately in it, but still, you know, full on, no punches held back. Is that they're in these situations that, God, if there's anything that's going to let these people connect, I mean, Rumaan, it's a disaster. They don't know what's going on. And Lynn, I mean, the school is a disaster, God bless it. You know, the children are like, you know, highly, highly at risk because of what's going on in their lives, because of New York City, like everything. And you know, and there are still these barriers. So I would love for y'all to talk about the points because y'all did find points where the characters did break those barriers and points they didn't. So I'd love for y'all to address that if you wouldn't mind.
You want me to go?
So, well, I don't know. I mean, you're talking, like, the way in which fiction has to talk about race is, you know, it's like, it's the same way in which society has to have a conversation about race, and which society mostly declines to have it. And to some extent, I think, like, Lynn, your book, like, there's a confrontation between whiteness and blackness, exactly as there is in my book. It's funny, having this conversation really shows me how similar our books are in ways that I, like, never actually thought about, especially when Delaney mentioned teeth. I, like, forgot that teeth are kind of a central image for both of our books. It's a very weird, I guess we really are good friends, so it makes sense. But anyway, the books, I think, I don't know, they seem to we seem to be pushing ourselves to dramatize this like literalized confrontation between blackness and whiteness that we rarely get to actually have in polite society. And do you think that's true? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I also think like the thing that we were playing with, which at least that I was playing with, and again, now we sort of conflated our books, but the thing that I was playing with is, I think, first of all, is that the character is named in the first present action section as a white woman. Like the concept of race as an issue for everyone and not just an issue for people who are non-white feels like the beginning of how, at least I as a white woman, think it's worth talking about, right? Because when I have a student who comes into my classroom who is white, they don't feel any responsibility to explain or name the character's race. But when I have a student who comes into my classroom who is Black or brown, there's all of this sort of hedging and couching and this. So I think, to me, again, as a white woman, my first responsibility was to just name it and to acknowledge that there's a difference there and to acknowledge that I don't understand. You know, like I think a lot of the character's relationship to her colleagues is one of the tensions that the book is really interested in, is like, okay, sure, you can read all the books in the world, but there are things that you will never fully understand. And also knowledge is not the same as intimacy, right? And so I think, you know, the character knows enough to know she doesn't understand. So her knowledge, instead of maybe giving her intimacy, which she thought probably that knowledge would give her at some point, just makes her feel that much more careful around these individuals that she wants to feel close to. Now, I would argue, like, I'm not my character, and I would say in my life, like, that is the beginning of how to have a relationship with someone who's of another race, is to say, dude, I don't understand, you know? And so, and I'm white, and I'm, you know, and I'm going to name my race, and I'm going to name your race, and I'm going to say, like, I don't understand, and I never will. And so again, I think that insofar as my project wanted to engage with race, I started in the space of acknowledging my misunderstanding and acknowledging where I sit in the conversation as equally implicated in it as everybody else.
Yeah. I think you handled that beautifully. Molly Pease has a question, but I just want to finish. I didn't want to step on you, Rumaan, if you were going to speak to what Lynn just said, because it was really good points. And also really quickly, you inverted, of course, in your book with Ruth and GH being the homeowners. So that
the expectation, because they're wealthier.
Talk about that.
Yeah.
And then
go
to your question.
Yeah, my book is about a confrontation between rich Black people and less rich white people, right? Like they're not, you know, they're still rich. And so there's a complication of class, which is also like a kind of one of the unspoken complications of race in American society. You know, one of the projects of whiteness generally has been to hold up examples like Obama, right? Like, well, we had a Black president, so the problem is solved. Or to use an example that Lynn likes to use, this CEO is Black, so the problem is solved. All you have to do is get your act together and become the CEO of a company. It's much more complicated than that. But class is a very interesting complication in our attempt to make a conversation about race about binary, which it is not. And I mean, there's no way in which a fiction can ever really like address, or not address, but, you know, satisfactorily clarify anything. But I think that one of the things that maybe our books share is a willingness to actually simply say something that for a long time was not polite to talk about. You know, simply the way Lynn just said it, which is that, like, if I am white, I can't comprehend what it is to be Black, but I can acknowledge that inability to comprehend. And that can begin what might turn into actual human knowledge of you as a human being. You know, we can be friends because we have, you know, we've confronted it rather than pretended around it. But I think I think we're still dealing with a kind of vestige of 1970s liberalism, you know, the Black hand shaking the white hand. I think we're still kind of laboring under that particular illusion, and it unfortunately has not got us very far, has it?
Right, great. I think that you really embodied that with Amanda's relationship with Ruth and GH, and also a very nuanced difference between how she relates to GH as opposed to Ruth. attraction to GH that she allows herself to feel a moment of. All of that is so, it's almost like that's a little safe room she lets herself go to, where she would never, you know, like be attracted to Ruth as someone that she would confine with the mother, right?
Yeah.
Or, you know, I don't want to be piggy. I want to get to Molly's, but I love that y'all spoke about that. Thank you. Molly Pease has a question for Rumaan, which Lynn, we'd love to hear you weigh in also. As Rumaan was writing this book, did he have in his mind what was really going on in the outside world, even though the reader never finds out? Or, Rumaan, did you leave that open in your own head as you were writing? And she also says, thank you so much, love the book. So,
thank you. Thank you. That's a really good question. And as Lynn can attest, you control a lot. I mean, a book is entirely made up. A novel, you control every decision. So there's no way in which, like, sometimes I hear writers talk about, like, oh, the character just wanted to do this, and it's sort of like quasi-mystical. And I don't think that's really true, or hasn't really been my experience, because it's all an act of authorial control. So it may surprise people to know that my book is about a group of 6 people sheltering in a house from an emergency. And I never really defined for myself what the emergency was, because it's not important. It would be like describing the wallpaper in a bathroom that a character never goes into. There's no reason to do it. So the important thing is not the emergency, but the human response to it. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Lynn, like,
I feel weirdly
right?
like I should have done all your events and you should have done mine, because
Yeah,
I have so many opinions about this, which is just to say that, like, I feel like one of the things, I'm sorry, Molly, you didn't ask me, but I'm going to quickly respond, which is just to say, like, I feel like one of the things we talk about a lot is that every novel has its own logic. And I just remember all the conversations we had where it's like the world that this novel has created is the world of that house. And so the disaster that happens in that house is the sound. And then it's Archie, right? Like the disaster, what you're in charge of is creating the logic and the sort of progression of intensity of the world. And so those are the terms upon which it was built. So to me, as soon as I heard the question, I was like, well, the sound and Archie's teeth, like that's the disaster, because that's part of what the book is about, right? Is that we're all sort of on these islands of angst, experiencing the disasters in very different terms, which again feels more upsetting in our present circumstances.
Yeah. But it's like, it's just a machine. Like, this is something that actually I really feel like I've learned from these conversations I've had with Lynn over the last, like, quite a few years now, is that, like, the book is a machine. It's not necessarily a machine to make you feel, but it's a machine to make you think, and you pick and choose the parts that the machine requires. And the machine doesn't require, in my case, a concrete emergency. And it's so funny because when my first draft of this book, my editor said to me, she, like, referred to the emergency offhand, and she said aliens. She was like, well, when the aliens are landing. And I was like, aliens? What on earth are you talking about?
So wrong.
And I realized that, like, this book, but actually maybe every book in some way, is a Rorschach test. Like, what you see in the book tells you what it is you really think and believe. And so, like, I guess my old editor really is thinking about aliens. I guess it's sort of like a pressing concern for her. It's really funny to think about. But that was the scariest thing she could conjure. The most frightening thing she could conjure was aliens. I still think that's so funny.
That's so wrong.
I sort of really deeply love it and kind of wish you would write like a weird little one-off.
An alien book, yeah.
The aliens are taking the lead. It's so good. From Ben Izzo, sorry, Ben. Can Rumaan talk about the contractor Danny's function in the novel and why he has them enter the narrative when he does? It's such a great scene with Danny and
so
GH.
For context, the book takes place almost entirely in this house, and there's like, it's sort of like a like hot house environment. But at the end of the book, they do finally leave and they talk to another human being, and it's such a relief. I think maybe it just had to happen. Like, the book had to draw to its conclusion, and that is like one of the conventions of the storytelling, right? Like, if it's a serial killer drama, like, at some point, like the victim who's being held in the dungeon is going to like almost escape and talk to a cop, and something will almost happen, and then she'll probably get killed anyway, because that's how those movies work. But I think in some ways it's just a narrative convention. But it also was important, even if I don't say what's happening outside in the world, I had to say there's less hope than you think. That makes it sound so bleak, but like they have a lot of faith that seeing this person will make them feel better. And in fact, seeing this person does not make them feel better. And that felt like a really important part of what the book was trying to accomplish philosophically, I guess. I don't know. This is something, again, that like Lynn and I talk about all the time, which is like the book has to have a shape, and it has to have like a form that the reader, that works on the reader, that seduces them into it. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of disconnected sentences and ideas on the page. It has to have like a movement to it. And I think that's right. And I think that Danny is part of making the book have a movement to it.
Yeah, and showed other facets of the issues of racism and male hierarchy.
Yes, yeah.
Ralph Barton has a question. Ralph, would you unmute and you can ask it?
I'm unmuting, and I have to admit that I never noticed that my husband's name was on the thing. Anyway, this is Amy. Love your book, Rumaan. Lynn, I will look for yours. You talk about the fact that the world of the story is the home, and that was what is important. But at the same time, you allude to future and other places throughout. Like, well, that family is never coming back from San Diego, and that person is dying in an elevator. So I feel like you brought me out of the world. Yeah. But then, what was your thinking in doing that?
So I have like I'm going to give you like a really pretentious answer, because I love actually giving this answer. So buckle up. Domestic is a term that has been deployed in talking about fiction for a long time. And I have noted, and I've discussed with my colleagues who are women, Lynn among them, the ways in which it is applied to work by women more than by men. As though work that is about family life is less interesting or smaller or more minor compared to work that is about war or economics or whatever. I don't even know what other books are about, because family life is the only thing that I think a book is fundamentally can be about, even if you're writing about Mars. So, the example I always use is that, yes, Alice Munro writes domestic fiction, but so does Jonathan Franzen. But we only use that term for Alice Munro, and there's a reason. I wanted to write a book that was so clearly a domestic, because it never really leaves the house. But as you just said, the book dips out of the house and goes to North Korea and Iran and over the Atlantic Ocean to Annapolis, Maryland, to a prison in Georgia, very, very specifically, in exactly the way that Alice Munro can write a story that takes place in the drawing room of a shabby house in Ontario, and in 2 sentences duck into the European theater during the Second World War, and then get you right back and show you how the two relate. So that is my answer to you, that family life holds everything, I think. It's as big as all the world. As Lynn just said before when she was talking about breastfeeding, like why in some weird way, why is every novel not about this? And it's like, well, I think we know why every novel is not about that. I think we know the answer.
But you don't think touching into those other places pulls the reader into, I'm going to find out whether this is planes or drones or the aliens in your editor's case?
It's just not important to me. It's unimportant to me. I think it's more important to say that like what takes place around a family's dining table is intimately connected to what takes place on the global stage. They have to be thought about with some simultaneity. That's a hard word to say. And I think that's okay. And it was just fun to be able to get out of the house, because I was really sick of being there after 200
well, that all
pages,
makes sense. And it's very interesting in terms of your thinking about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that brings us to a question from Meredith for both of y'all, who would love to know how the pandemic changed how y'all have talked about your books and connecting to readers versus how y'all expected to talk about your books and connect with readers while you were writing and editing them pre-pandemic. Lynn, do you want to go first with that one?
Yeah, Lynn, you take that one.
Well, I mean, I think we're both you know, it's writing to me and language to me and books to me are so intimate that it feels sad to not share bodies in space to talk about books. It feels sad. I mean, I think like one of my dearest friends was nominated for a National Book Award and I didn't get to go take him for a drink, you know, like that felt really sad. And even back to the idea of that Rumaan was saying about like making cupcakes, like there is something to ritual that matters. And I think, and I hope that we've learned through this process that like we do really gain something by bringing bodies together in spaces and celebrating one another and having conversations. And I teach a lot and I, you know, tear up a lot for whatever reason. So, you know, about once a month, I look at my students and I'm like, you guys, I wish, you know, anyways, to answer your question, it has been sad in the way of losing bodies in spaces. It also has been weirdly, surprisingly good in other ways, right? Like I'm not in New York right now. Rumaan is in New York. We can do this event together. I've gotten to do other events with other writers who are across the country. I've gotten to talk to people about my book that probably I would not have spoken to. So in that way, you know, it's had its positive surprises. I very much look forward to taking Rumaan out for a drink.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I'm ready for that drink. But yeah, I think if you don't have COVID-19, what can you say but, well, it's terrible, but I don't have COVID-19, right? Like if no one in your family, if you haven't lost life, how can you complain, really? Yeah, it sucks, but it sucks for everybody. And there are varieties of suck, you know, and like the inability to like go to a crowded bookstore or bookstore crowded with all the people you know the day that your book comes out is like, it pales in comparison to like real loss, you know? So you can't really dwell on mourning that kind of stuff. And I think Lynn and I think the other thing that we have both maybe lately come to, or I shouldn't even say lately, I think that you and I have talked a lot still by phone. We worked together on Zoom last week. It was very cute. And I think that is like our realizing that it's important to maintain that kind of thing, you know, because it's important. It's important. It's not good for you. It's not good for your mental health. It's not good for your psychic health. And it's okay to say like, I got to talk to a friend. I got to talk to someone who is not one of my children or my spouse. I mean, for God's sake, I got to talk to someone who's not one of my children. Like, and that's okay. It's totally valid. I think it's a tough one though, because nobody wants to complain in the context where there are people with very serious and dire complaints out there, you know?
Yeah. We have 4, 5-ish, 5, the 5th question kind of intersects questions before we end. So I want to get them for y'all. Jessica Schwartz is wondering which of y'all's books should a person read first and why? So Lynn, do you want to like give an answer for that so we can get all these great questions in, and Rumaan, then you can speak to that too.
Yeah, I mean, I want you to start with one, I guess, you know. I mean, I will say my experience is maybe it's different in this way, but I think for me with my first book, I was learning to write a book and I had a very specific idea of like what a book was in advance. And I think with this book, I had the courage to try to write a book that maybe only just try to like reconsider what I thought a book could be. And so I think I would say start with one, if only because I'm interested in the way I tried. That was very solipsistic answer, but I wanted to stretch the form, I hope in an interesting way. And I hope that feels exciting.
Great.
Yeah, that's a good, am I supposed to ask, am I supposed to answer which of my own books or which of?
Oh, yeah, I mean, we could go on forever.
Yeah, I guess, you know what, honestly, yeah, read my new book because it's new and, you know, I don't know, it's good. Maybe it's better. You know, I think the truth is that like writing, and I think this is also like something that people don't love to hear, writing is a practice and you get better at the practice as you proceed. And so it's very rare, I think, very, very rare for me to come across a writer whose first book is better than their 4th or 5th book. It's extremely rare. In fact, the only person I can think of is Anita Bruckner. But she's a weirdo. She emerged fully formed, you know?
Yeah.
But it's very, very rare. So I do think the books, like, I think you improve, you learn something, and it's also closer to the time, you know? It's closer, like, Lynn and I wrote these books in 2019? 18. So, you know, they're more connected to what's happening in the culture by virtue of that.
That's great. And Barbara Stewart has a question. Barbara, will you unmute, please, so you can ask a question? They can get it in, and we have 2 or 3 more after y'all.
Okay. Hello, both authors. I find you both to be such interesting people. Rumaan, this is my 2nd session with you. Fabulous. Thank you.
Oh,
and Lynn,
you.
Can't wait to read your book. So I'm wondering whom you guys like to read when you have spare time. That's a joke, spare time. I know you're very busy people, but who are some of your authors that you'd recommend to us?
You go.
Oh God, this is like we could spend an hour talking about this. What have I read recently that you know what, I think that like I would go back to like the writers who bring me the greatest pleasure in terms of their interest in language, a writer like Saul Bellow, or in terms of their interest in where language meets story, a writer like Willa Cather. I mentioned Anita Bruckner, who is an evergreen for me, and one person I will never stop talking about that no one ever takes me up on, although Lynn has, is Patrick Modiano, who won the Nobel Prize in 2014 and is an extraordinary writer. There's a huge body of work that's very easy to get your hands on at the library and is entirely worth reading, although strangely neglected, I think, in this country, despite winning the Nobel Prize. Yeah. Lynn, what is your answer?
I don't know. I have some. I'm reading this essay. We were just talking about. I'm reading this essay collection by Shirley Hazard, whose novels, Transit of Venus, I love a lot, and I've not read her essays before, and they're pretty amazing. And I also just read. I've been reading a lot of nonfiction, and I just read. I realize maybe an embarrassing, but I read Knausgaard's. He wrote this short book about Edvard Munch, just like about his work. It's called So Much Longing, So Little Space. And it's just, you have to sell books the way that Knausgaard sells books to get anyone to let you write a book like this, because he's just thinking and talking about a single artist, but it's so exciting and interesting and just like, I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about what art is worth, I think, especially right now for probably obvious reasons. And so I've been reading these people who are trying to grapple with that same idea. I mean, maybe one more just because my book is filled with books. So if you read it, there are a lot of recommendations. But one that I love a lot that I got a text recently that someone else really liked is a book called Corregidora by a writer named Gail Jones, which came out, I think, in the 70s. And it's about sort of generational violence. Toni Morrison said that Jones reinvented how to write a book about a Black woman. So it's a pretty extraordinary book.
That's great. All right, we have a few more questions we're going to ask quickly, and y'all can give a condensed answer. Marilyn Johnson wants to know, was it fun or even liberating to make fun of rich people?
It's my hobby. That's my answer. It's my hobby.
That's a good one.
It's one of my greatest hobbies.
Did I make fun of rich people?
Oh, Lynn, come on. Do you not know this about yourself?
No, of course. It was complicated, and you know, it was all the things.
Okay, that's a great And I'm going to blend the last 2 together. From Cynthia, what did you expect us to feel at the end of your novels? Hopeless, hopeful, especially now during COVID. And then also from Amy, masquerading as Ralph. The pandemic question is how did they feel about their books being received because of the pandemic? It felt more scary than it would have at another time. So again, like what you're leaving the reader with what you expected to leave the reader with the understanding that of course you don't totally know, and then what you have, and those are wonderful questions to end on. Then I'll finish. I mean,
unfortunately, you never know, right? Like you never know what is going to be happening in a cultural context when you produce a work that has a very long runway. And also the cultural context can always change extremely quickly and make things that once seemed important seem very unimportant. Think about like a book that was published on August 23rd of 2001 and how it looked 2 weeks later. There's simply no way to predict the way the culture turns, but the idea is to create something that will always be reflective of the culture. And so I think that Lynn's book, in its interest in family and money, is talking about something that's evergreen. It's not talking about the specifics of one thing. Like, there's just no way to predict that kind of thing. I wish there was. I don't know. What do you think, Lynn?
I mean, similar, right? And I think we've had this conversation. My book came out a little bit before Rumaan's. It came out in July, and I had a few different conversations where people were sort of like, "How did you know?" And I was a little bit like, "How did you not?" Like this thing of like the systems are broken. Oh my God, the systems are broken, and it's like, yeah, but the systems have been broken for a long time. But I think too, to answer the other question of the endings, like just to make an argument for, like, I'm a big believer that Rumaan's ending is hopeful. And I think that mine is too. I think to his point, like it is sort of a Rorschach, like you can read them both in different ways, but I think when I thought about the ending, I wanted to land in a space that was transient in the way that I think grace is, but also suggested that it's possible, because I do think hope and joy and all of those things, like they're possible and they're real and they're alive in the world, but they flit away. And so if you're someone who wants something to land and say, no, it's good now, don't read my books. or
read a book that does that, but then read a book, like I think it's also okay to read like an Agatha Christie and just say like, okay, they solved the murder and I feel better about the world. Like we all need those kinds of pleasures sometimes, but I think you're right, Lynn. I don't think your book is unhopeful, but I also don't think it's not an Agatha Christie. No. But we should all read more Agatha Christie. We all need a little moment of joy, just like we need those cupcakes, Yeah.
Well, y'all, this was better than cupcakes. Get to your weekend without these books in your house. You can order them, put them on hold through your local library. And then there are lots of other ways you can get books that we don't have to go into that you know about. Audio, all kinds of ways. But most important, please unmute. Help me thank Lynn and Rumaan, and then Joan is going to say goodnight for us. Thank you all for this beautiful hour.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Great.
Hey, thank you. Thank you so much, Delaunay, for hosting this, and your questions that got the conversation going were excellent. And I truly appreciate this. This was a wonderful experience for everybody who was here. And of course, my heartfelt thanks to Lynn and Rumaan for this program. And I kept thinking these books would have never been written 25 years ago. This was something that had to be written right now. And I appreciate this. And I look forward. One of the questions was, which one should I read first, Lynn's book or Rumaan's book? Oh. We still didn't quite get the answer to that. I mean, Lynn, you said yours first, but Rumaan.
Lynn's book came out first, so you should read Lynn's first.
Oh, or read them together. I'm suddenly thrilled by this idea of them just sort of right next to each other.
That's a little hard for me, but I think everybody here at least does read two books at once because it's the way we are. So again, thank you all. Thank the audience for coming. We appreciate this. Please go to the Chappaqua Library website to see all the other programs that are coming up. And of course, to book YaYa and what's coming up on their slate. And again, thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you, Rumaan and Lynn.
Thank you.
Thank you.